I had a family vacation at Disney World last week, a week and a half ago, I guess. So, and every time I go, I am amazed at the sales, the marketing, the customer service that they provide. There's been a few places I've been where whether it's like a really 4-star high-end restaurant or 4-star gold resort hotel or something like that. There's just, even in the modern world, it seems like it's even fewer and fewer places you go where it's just customer service or just people that have absolutely nailed what they're trying to do. And Disney in particular is interesting because all he wanted to do was just entertain and make people happy, which is, you got to admit, that's a very broad goal to have. Yeah, and it's not just like a couple of people, it's everybody. He just entertain as much people as much as he can. And when you go to at least Disney World, I don't know, if Euro, or I think there's like 6 Disneys around the world now, and there's like one in Tokyo, and there's obviously the one out in California and France, and there's one somewhere in the Mideast somewhere, but I'm not sure if it's the same in all of them, but definitely the Disney World in particular is one that is a fascinating, basically story about how to build something. And in particular, I was thinking about it from the idea of building something and enhancing it and making it so that people like keep wanting to come back, and it doesn't lose its initial goal. In software, it doesn't get away from solving the core problem or problems that you originally tackled to create the software, but it does make those improvements, and it does sort of bring people along for the ride so that you don't have jarring, like releases or versions or something where now people start complaining, well, it used to always be this way and now you do it differently, and I don't know if I like it anymore, and stuff like that. And so that's where I wanted to, in thinking about it, because I drove down there, so I had plenty of time to ponder this in my mind as I came back. So I figured, sort of applying some of what Disney did and what exists down in Disney World, and as I've seen it evolve over the decades, and maybe some lessons we can take for creating software. So it's essentially a case study. I'll go back and talk a little bit more about just Walt Disney World and what it is, particularly if you're not, don't really know how it's set up or anything like that. And we're going to talk about how they, some key, I think, ideas that come out of how they created this thing. They started simple and about having the right staff, not stuff, but staff, building for the future, incremental enhancements, and then talk about things like maintenance windows and partial features and things of that nature. Again, translating these into the software development world. Now, Walt Disney World originally, this is down in Florida. Originally, it was just Magic Kingdom, which is Cinderella's castle, which is the iconic castle as you saw in this first slide. This is not the one in Disney World, but it's essentially, and this castle's a little different. Actually, it may actually be somebody else's castle, but it is the one whenever you see any Disney movie, it starts out with like people flying over a pond to the castle. Well, I think the one in the movies is the one that's in Disneyland in California, but the one at Disney World in Florida looks almost the castle's the same. It's just a little different approach as you come into the castle. So he started out now almost 50 years ago. It was just the Magic Kingdom. It was an amusement park, had worlds within it. There's about 6, I think there's originally 5 or 6 sections. So they had like Tomorrowland and Wilderness Country and Main Street USA and a couple others. And they had, some hotels around there and maybe a couple little water park things, but not really like themed stuff, just sort of, places had like pools and lazy rivers and stuff like that. So just a nice place to go probably when it started, you could go and take the family and spend a day, maybe 2 days, hanging out at Magic Kingdom, and it's in an area where they bought thousands and thousands of acres, so you had to drive. Initially, I think you probably had to drive 10 or 15 minutes from nearby Orlando just to get to the Magic Kingdom area. So it was sort of off on its own, and it allowed you to really to sort of an immersive kind of experience in being in an amusement park. Over the years, they've added parks to it. So they started with this core idea of the Magic Kingdom, and it was very Disney. If you think of like the core Disney of like Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck and Goofy and Pluto and Minnie and all of that kind of stuff. And then they started adding these others. The first one they added was Epcot, which is almost like a World's Fair kind of amusement park that just is always there. They've got a front end that's sort of a small, typical amusement park kind of thing. But then they have the back end of it is just this huge lake, and around the lake are areas that are specialized for different countries. So you sort of feel like you're in the idea is so that you feel like you're in that country a little bit. And they've got everything from, they've got like Canada and Great Britain and Mexico and France and Germany and, so on and so forth. They've got just a bunch. Like I forget all the companies or all the countries that are there, but it's like 9, 10, 11 countries, something like that are represented around the lake. And then they started adding, they've got Animal Kingdom, and then they've added they added the Hollywood, so they've got some stuff that's more movie based, and then they've got a couple water parks that have their own, that are themed water parks. Well, as you look at this, one of the things is they had plenty of room for growth, and they still do. There's still, it's all swampland that's down there that they can grow. So they could add parks, and they will. They've got plans to create more parks over the years. One of the things they've done, which is interesting, is it's self-sustaining to some extent. They've got huge areas of like greenhouses and stuff like that, where they've got all of this stuff they do in order to create like lettuce and spices and vegetables, like tomatoes and stuff like that. They've got huge amounts of stuff that they've got all of this technology they use to create food, so that a lot of they actually feed a lot of the people that come through there with stuff that was grown on in their land or on their land. And it's not necessarily in the land, because they've got all of these like hanging devices and stuff like that, and they've got tours of it, of how they do all these like hydroponics and stuff like that is actually pretty fascinating when you think about how many people come through and how much food must be moved around. But they've also got they bring in all insane amount of like fuel and all kinds of other stuff to support all the people that are moving through there. And sort of to swing back around to the initial thing here is, when Disney looked at creating this thing 50 years ago, he was really, if you look at it, he really was thinking of it growing to what it is today. I mean, he died before, I think there's been a couple parks that have actually been created since he passed away, but this was a big vision that he had. And, along the way, as I said, this is now over 50 years, it's been relatively small steps. It may feel like big steps at times, but there were small steps to get to that. And so that sort of, I think, hopefully will lay the groundwork for where we want to go with this little presentation. So you start simple. Start with something very simple, but that works, that solves a problem. With this case, he really started with Mickey Mouse, and things revolved around that. And then, of course, they had a couple of really cornerstone movies that they had made, like Sleeping Beauty and Cinderella. And that was the basis for the Magic Kingdom. Took a couple of things, in this case, think about it. You've got your problem that you want to solve, and you do that well. You focus on that. Don't try to be everything to everybody, but try to define your niche appropriately. And then, that's what you need to nail. From his point of view, he had these like anchor rides that now have become movies and stuff. So he had things or attractions. So he had 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and he had Pirates of the Caribbean, and he had the Haunted Mansion, and Space Mountain, and It's a Small World, and some things like that were really became iconic and very much are part of that brand. Which, from a software, you think about that is you want to have a couple of, not only do you solve that problem, but you've got, either a key way or a couple of key ways of dealing with that problem that then can be, that are distinguishing between your product and everything else out there. It really becomes your brand to some extent. And you can see that in very effective stuff that's out there. Even in software, I mean, you think about Apple and Macs and maybe Microsoft and Windows. If you look at either operating system, you almost immediately know what you're looking at. There are certain ways that they approach, just the UI. There's a way that they do it, and they pretty much stick to it. Varying, Apple is much more restrictive in what they allow on their operating system to be a qualified piece of software. So, they're much more restrictive. So just about any application you look at, you're going to be able to tell pretty quickly. It's especially if you poke around on it all, you're going to be able to tell you're on a Mac. Windows, there's the Windows style guides and stuff like that some people follow. So odds are you're probably going to have a good idea of it, but then some people don't. So, you may have a few rogues out there. You think about supporting attractions. So you think about from solving a problem is you've got the core problem, but then maybe you've got a couple other things that just make that user experience a little better. Things that not just solving the problem, but now I want to solve the problem in a way that makes my customers want to use this on a regular basis. I want to have a couple of features or a user experience that really draws them in and does so in a way that they enjoy, essentially, ideally, enjoy working with your software, with your product. And this really becomes the cornerstone of your brand. If you can master this simple thing that you're working on, then that gives you a foundation to move forward. And of course, it also gives you something to hang your hat on. You can say, look, regardless of whatever else goes on, we solve this problem better than anybody else. Ideally is where you want to get to. Now you've laid that foundation, but then in getting to that point, and then also in being able to move forward, you really have to have the right team. You got to have people, and I've seen this so much as we talk about patterns and anti-patterns and building teams and chemistry and things like that. You got to have people that buy into the vision. You got to have some not necessarily the whole team, but you definitely have some key people on your team, the leadership that really buy into the vision, that believe in what you believe in, that really want that solution to that problem. They say that is the solution to the problem. And with it, they care about solving that problem. It's not just about building the right solution. It's also caring about solving that problem, because that caring carries over to the customers and the users. And that's where you get people that on both sides of the equation that, build a product. Those that actually build it, but then also those that build it by buying it, by purchasing it, by enjoying that product. And again, you think about, some iconic products out there. You think about like Apple. You can tell that they want people to enjoy using their products. They solve the problem, but then on top of that, with that, they want to solve the problem in a way that people are like, I like looking at songs on my iPod or playing around with my iPod, even though it's a very simple interface, because I just do. That's the kind of people they want. That's the culture that they have. Now, this is a very high demand. And when it's a small team, it's like just you and a buddy or something like that. Then, you're doing this probably because you love it. And then, your buddy or your original core team is probably doing it because they love it. So initially it may not be as hard because that's sort of how you got to the problem. Is it, you chewed over it enough time, you had such a drive to solve it that you were you sort of gathered with people of a like mind. Now, as you grow, it becomes harder because then you've got to go sort of recruit people into that. And that, depending on what you're doing, it may or may not be something that typically people even care or know about, much less are, very fired up about working with it. So it can be hard to, you're setting the bar sort of high to say, I want to have a team that really cares. But if you have that team, the rewards are incredibly high as well, because that does allow you to build a product that can just absolutely stomp everybody else in the market. Because there's only so many people that love solving that problem or love that niche that you're in. And if you can more or less corner the market on those people, then you're going to be able to pretty much take out all of the opposition, because you're going to have the people that really care. You're going to have the people that do it best. And it's not necessarily skills. It's based on they love what they do, and you'll find that people that really love what they do find ways to do that stuff better than those that don't. I'd rather have a hard worker than someone that's smart but doesn't really care. That's sort of that kind of a mindset. But along with all this, you can't just have a bunch of believers and have it all fall into place. You really need to craft the roles of that team. You think about like an American football team. If everybody wanted to be quarterback, it's not going to work very well. If everybody wanted to be running back, it's not going to work very well. You need to get the right people for the right places, and you have to understand that there are different roles. In software, we sort of know it, but sometimes we sort of brush over some of those roles. We can think at a high level that you've got coders or implementers, you've got maybe designers and business analysts and testers, and maybe some sort of a DevOps role. But even within those, there are nuances to those. So there's a difference between a manual tester and an automated tester. There's a difference between a developer that knows front end and back end and middle tier. And there's things like that depending on what you're building and how the size of your team and the scope and some things like that, there's going to be those roles probably always exist. It's just in some cases those roles will be sort of one person will serve multiple roles because they can. But then as you grow, you're going to find more and more that you got to have the right specialists involved. And this gets the idea of having a culture to your group, to your team, to your company that starts at the top. The leader has to be able to drive that, but also from the ground up, you've got to be able to hire people that sort of have that already in them. And from the Disney point of view, I talked a lot about what Disney's vision was, but if you look at the people that work there, by and large, they have that same desire. A great example of my most recent trip, several years ago, I went and my daughter was 5 or 6 years old. And I noted that everybody that she dealt with that worked, all of the staff members that worked at the Disney resorts always referred to her as Princess, which I thought, well, that's pretty neat that's just how you do it. That is the culture. And then this last time I was there, and there's this lady that was definitely not young. She's at least into her 30s and 40s, maybe 50s or 60s. And she was in a wheelchair, and I didn't really notice why. I don't know if she was injured or what, but she was asking a lady there, one of the workers, how to get to something. And the worker referred to her as Princess, which really, it sort of said it again. It's like they have this desire to make you feel loved, to make you feel like you belong, that they care about you. And that would be, that's that kind of thing. It's that culture that it helps to be able to push it from the top. So you've got somebody that leads and shows you that, but also from the ground up is to hire the right staff to, maintain that culture. Especially now when you think of, Disney's been gone for years and years and years, but you still have these people that have been hired in that felt the same way, and they hire people that feel the same way. And so you actually get a sustainable drive for your team and a sustainable culture. So when you're putting something together, we'll step back a little bit and let's think about actually moving forward with something like that. You've got this product, you've got this, or you got a problem you want to solve. And then with that, you've got really a product that you maybe envisioned. We talk a lot about not getting yourself stuck on the future vision and actually being able to implement things and steady progress and being able to have regular goals and stuff like that. But I think this is a good time to also say, when you start, it doesn't hurt to have some really big goals. You may start with a very little product, but if you want to really dive into this thing, if this is an area that you really care about, then maybe you want to expand your goals. It's that whole, if you shoot for the stars and you miss, maybe you'll hit the moon, that kind of a thing. And also I think it helps you avoid getting to a point where you start, and you see this a lot in like middle-size companies. They go from small and they do really good and they get to a mid-size and they sort of stall out. And if you look deeper into what they've done, a lot of times it's because they didn't have big enough goals. So they really shot themselves in the foot. They had all these little short goals and they really just aimed for those without thinking about the larger goals and designed themselves into a corner essentially. They did some things that maybe worked good early on, but also limited their growth in the future. And that can be, that's what you want to avoid. Is you want to have some vision, you want to have something bigger that you can, keep tapping that every so often, even while you're working on these shorter term and realistic and achievable goals, that you've still got this bigger thing that you're working on, that you're working towards, and drive the team to continue being moving towards that, as opposed to the whole idea of, hey, we'll just get this done a week from now and then we'll boom, we can sign off on it. It's like, no, that's just a step of many towards this grand vision that we have. So when you combine that big vision with a practical roadmap, then you have a way. You have not only I want to go from A to Z, this big huge Z, whatever that happens to be, but you also give everybody the A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way through all the steps to some extent. The closer, the shorter term ones should be very clear and well defined, but even sort of down the road, you can see where this stuff is going. Because when you do that, you're going to allow them the ability to, or not necessarily allow them the ability, but also sort of drive home that they need to have like hooks in place and room for growth, so they don't design themselves into a corner, or so that you don't design yourself into a corner. Think about what you're doing in a way that will allow you to grow that thing at some point. Allow for changes and even new goals. We've had several times we've talked about the idea of coding stuff in a way where maybe one of your questions is, will we ever need somebody to do X, or will we ever need to support Y? Because in so doing, you're sort of setting an expectation and even a context and a framework for how you're going to solve that problem. Because if you never, like, let's think about something simple. If you're never going to have to support a database other than the one you're working with today, then you can hard code the connection to that database style and how you work with that all the way through your code. And it does sort of simplifies things and makes things move a little more smoothly and faster, because you're not leaving the hooks in for future support of another database. But if at some point you need to support another database, now you're sort of hosed. So there is it's a fine line. It's finding that balance of, maybe I want to take advantage of what my goals are today, but I want to do so in a way that would allow me to, without too much extra work, be able to shift gears down the road. In the database example, it's like, okay, I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do this in a way that would allow me to, maybe all of this database stuff is based off of like a root class or a core class, that if I wanted to, somewhere down the road, I could change that core class to, maybe now it's core MySQL and everything's based off of that. But maybe I could come back later and I could actually create a core Oracle and take everything off of that. And stuff like that. You don't want to overthink it, but also you don't want to underthink it. And particularly when we're talking about like products that are not one-offs or just little demos or proof of concepts or something like that, where this is something where you say, this is something that can grow. This is something I want to pursue for a while, not just for the next 3 to 6 months. And so this gets into a little bit about that planning for the future. The first thing is never say never, as I just showed in that example. If you say, no, we're never going to need to support another database, well, you don't know that. That may come a point, particularly if it's a product that's going to be around for 5, 10, 15 years. The stuff that you have today that you support may not even exist. So you may have to make some changes. And BHAGs are great, which is a big, hairy, audacious goal. You'll see this in some goal-setting books and stuff like that out there in articles. These are the kinds of things that are like, they're more than stretch goals. These are kinds of things that it's not just a goal that's, man, if we can do this, we are successful. It's, if we can do this, we have mastered this. We are beyond successful. And it doesn't hurt to at least name those kinds of things. If your goal is to create a product and have 100 users, that's awesome. So maybe your big goal is, my realistic goal, I want to get 100 users. My bigger goal, I'd love to have 1,000 users. My audacious goal would be 100,000 users, or something like that, is to name it so that you still have that huge goal, at least in the back of your mind. And that can help inform some of your design. For getting to that bigger, going from 100 to 1,000 or 100,000 users, one of the ways you can do that is instead of just a problem, then maybe you've got that problem that you're going to solve, but maybe you have like a family of problems you're going to solve. A lot of times you'll see this with lines of business. So it's like, we're going to do, let's say, accounting really good for construction companies. But as we're doing this, we realize that maybe down the road, we're going to be able to use that same stuff with a little bit of, maybe there's a little different flavor, but we're going to be able to do it for small mom and pop retailers and be able to do all their accounting. And then maybe down the road, we'll go to healthcare or banks or stuff like that, which is really where enterprise resource management and some of the big software like that, like your Salesforces and NetSuites and Bond and PeopleSoft and all these other things. That's sort of how they got to where they were. They started with a much more focused problem, but then realized that really they had a family of problems that they could solve. They found, we'll call it like related problems or similar problems, and they were able to take what they learned from problem A, apply that to problem B, and then grow a new product or extend the product that they had. Do your best to avoid dead ends. Do your best to avoid going down paths of implementation where it's like once you get there, you're done. You're not going to be able to extend it or add on to it or anything like that, where it's just too tightly defined. If the better you can avoid designing yourself or coding yourself into a corner, obviously the better. And one of the ways to do this is stay general in your approach as long as you can. Do as much as you can to solve problems in a general sense. And then, of course, at some point, you're going to get down to your specific problem. And that's fine. But if you've gotten pretty close to that last step of solving the specific problem and you've had a general approach all the way along, then it will most likely be easy to then take that and address it, modify it or extend it and address a different problem. Incremental enhancements. When you think about, and this was an interesting thing from the Disney point of view, is that you have rides that have now been around and attractions that have been around for 50 years. And in some cases, there's almost no change. If you think about it, It's a Small World, the ride is in many ways the exact same ride it was 50 years ago. But they have made some upgrades along the way. They have used technology and stuff like that, so the ride's a little smoother, a little cleaner, a little easier to maintain, I'm sure, things like that. So when you're thinking about growing your product, this is that same kind of idea. Is that maybe you've got some small and subtle changes that you can make along the way, so that your existing customer base is not it's not a jarring change for them. It's not something where they come in and are like, oh wow, this has changed a lot. It's just sort of a little bit here and a little bit there, so that it's evolved, but it may be the kind of thing they don't even notice it, or maybe even better yet, they come back over a year, you've made a bunch of little changes, and just it dawns on them at some point. It's like, wow, this thing has changed dramatically, and they didn't really know it. The kinds of things where you look at what did the thing look like 2 or 3 versions ago, and it's dramatically different when you look at it compared to the one today, but the people that used it never really saw all these little changes. And it may be like another menu option here, a menu option there, a little bit faster here, a little smoother interface, things like that. And this means that invisible changes are okay. We always like to have, particularly because we've got customers that are looking for it, they want changes that they can see, so that you can point to it and say, we did this, and now look, this went from blue to red, or there's these 3 things that you have that you didn't have before. There's other stuff. There's a lot of stuff you can do under the covers that will set the stage for these future features and enhancements, that it's perfectly fine to keep going with that, to do things under the cover, to make performance improvements, to make all these little back-end changes in that users don't really see, but you're setting the groundwork and laying that out for maybe some very big and substantial changes along the way. And the nice thing about those, whether it's small and subtle or even the invisible changes, is you do have an ability there to sort of experiment, where you can maybe turn something on for a little bit and then turn it back off if people don't like it, or if it breaks, or if it causes headaches. And in doing so, you can sort of allow things to bake in, which is that whole idea of those small and subtle changes going through, and users don't even really notice it, because they've just sort of, they've just gotten used to it. It's just baked into their user experience. And also with that, it gives you small and verifiable chunks. So you can add these little features, but be very sure of its of its quality, that it's bug free when you quote release it to the user base. You can try some stuff out. You can make a few changes. If it doesn't work, just get rid of it. Over the years, you'll see that in Disney and a lot of other parks, where there'll be maybe there's a little ride that shows up for a while, or an attraction or something like that. Or maybe it's a ride that's a little bit of a variation of another one. And you'll see either then, if that variation works, then maybe you'll see stuff more that grows off of that new variation. If it doesn't, then that just ends up being the only thing. And maybe eventually it gets closed or replaced or something like that. So that gives you the ability, you have this way to sort of experiment with things, doing them a little bit differently. You don't have to change everything, but you can get some feedback on that approach or that user experience, and then decide if it's something you want to keep with or not. Very simple from a user experience point of view. Maybe you go from drop downs, is that you say, it may be easier to have little the little dial type things to select values. So maybe you create a little feature. There's something that's sort of new, and on this screen you put a couple of those dials on and see if that works better than drop downs. And you'll probably get some feedback on it. Or you can, and also you can elicit it. So you can go to some users and say, hey, what do you think about that? If they like it, then you can start doing more of that, and maybe even backfill those into other pieces of interface. If they don't, then you just sort of drop it. And then, eventually you don't go to that for any future stuff. And then eventually maybe you go back and change those dials back to drop downs. And sooner or later, it'll be like that never existed. Maintenance windows are really interesting, and then doing sizable upgrades once you've got a product that's out there. It's not always practical. You think about an amusement park. If it's not open, they're not making money. So, it's essentially not practical to have enough time down to be able to create a new ride or bring a ride down and completely revamp it. And you may not be able to, sometimes you can't avoid that. You're going to have maintenance windows. You're just like, okay, we've got so much going on that we've gotten to a point like a watershed kind of release where we just can't do a partial update. We're going to have a maintenance window of, a couple days or a week or whatever it happens to be, so we can get all this stuff in. But ideally, create ways as you're going through, building your solution out. Create some ways that allow you to do partial updates that maybe have like a feature flag or something where you can turn something on and off. And so you can turn it off for a little bit, but then everything else is available to that point. So that your users are still doing everything that they need to use, but they are, there's maybe that one feature you're working on that's unavailable for a little bit while you're doing upgrades, or it's under construction. Creating stuff, releasing stuff with some features is better than having none. So if you're not really sure, if you're growing this thing out and you're adding a new, going into a new area, rather than wait till you've gotten it all the way done, it's probably going to be a lot better for you to release a couple of, sort of there, not necessarily sort of there, but some minor features that are allow users to sort of go down the path of this new feature, of this new grand area. For example, thinking back to that accounting thing, if you start off with construction and maybe you wanted to move towards, let's say real estate was going to be your next area of accounting. Well, maybe you start adding a couple of features that are available in that construction solution that really are not as much useful to the construction people, but would be useful to people in the real estate world. And you can probably think of some real world examples of this, because I've seen lots of products where they sort of support a new area that you can tell that they're thinking about getting into this other line of business, and they'll dip their toe in, and they may even start selling into that area, but they don't have a full featured solution yet. But at least they're in there. They're getting their name known. They're getting some feedback on those, those limited features, and allows that when they do get to the point of really full force going into that new line of business, they've got a little more comfort, and they've got a little more security of, as far as they're more sure that their ideas are going to be useful and, well accepted by people in that new area that they're going to. Don't be afraid to get rid of dead weight stuff. If you got something that isn't being used, find a way to sort of phase that out. It may be difficult because you may have a couple customers that are just diehards, love that dead weight kind of feature. So then you have to balance it out and figure out what are you going to do. Maybe you just wait for those customers to go away. I've seen some of those cases where people just wait and they figure sooner or later these customers are spending a lot of money for just a couple of features and they'll leave us. Or maybe they may price that dead weight feature, start increasing the price until everybody says, nope, we'll find something else. Or maybe you just have to find a migration path so that you can get rid of that stuff, so that what you have, especially over time, you have a solution that really is, lean and mean and sleek and does what you want it to do, and you don't have a lot of extra stuff that you have to carry forward with it. Prepare for the worst. This is really that, keeping yourself from designing into a corner, particularly from a maintenance window point of view, is you really want to be set up in a situation so that if something goes bad, ideally you don't lose everything, that the whole system isn't down. And this goes back to, good software design, so that you have pieces that are, coupled, separate services and things of that nature, so that at least there's some partial functionality as opposed to the whole thing being dead. And it's something we probably don't usually think of, but when we're designing software, that definitely should be a part of it. And then as we're implementing, it helps to have that in the back of your mind, because if you do, then you're going to have much more stable software in the long run. You'll at least have it, a partial uptime as opposed to being completely down. So sort of wrapping this final thoughts a little bit on this one. Disney, as I said, when Disney started this thing, he had this big vision in mind. He had this culture in mind. And the success of that company was on purpose. And he didn't stumble into stuff. He, worked hard, but also early on laid the groundwork and set a vision for this grand success. And this points to the power of vision and planning. Even if you're doing your own little side hustle thing, spend a little time thinking about what it is you're building, because it may be that if you can put together a vision of something huge and start laying the groundwork to get to that, you may find yourself the CEO of a very successful company somewhere down the road. Culture. The old, and I guess even modern idea of sales in a successful business is location. Being where you need to be has a huge impact on whether a company is going to be successful or not. In the software world, and then even in, I think, the service world, definitely culture is key. You got to have the right culture. You've got to have a match to your customers. You've got to have something that is really top to bottom, so that people have a consistent user experience with, everything about your product and about your brand has a feel that they can say, yep, that, they can link that to, your product, your company. I think it's important to remember that learning these things can really be fun. It can be very enjoyable to have a product that's got a solid foundation, but that allows you to experiment, to go out there and figure out, well, what if we do this? What if we do that? It can actually be besides being fulfilling and being able to sort of maybe even stumble across some solutions you never expected were out there. I think most of us, because we're solving these problems, learning how to do so, I think, tends to be fun to all of us. And so that brings us to questions and comments.
Hey there, Rob. Just wondering, when it comes to the place where you're creating the culture and you're creating a product, you mentioned this with a little earlier in the presentation. Do these things grow symbiotically together, or do you kind of thrust one more than the other at the beginning phases of the company /product /vision? Like, how does that look in your mind?
I think it's very. It will not grow symbiotically, I don't think. You may luck into it, because birds of a feather flocking together and things like that. But really, in reality, I think you have to be intentional about it. And this goes back to actually a little bit about some things you and I have discussed in lunches recently about culture and approach and things like that. Is that I think it is very key. It starts at the top. Is that you've got to have a CEO or a vision setter or goal setter or leaders that have that culture and that vision in mind, but also are very intentional about continuing it, about finding the people that will fit with that, as opposed to solving maybe a specific problem that they need. So instead of going for a hire where you need let's just picking some random thing. Let's say you've got to go hire a UI designer. You can go out and get a very good UI designer, but instead of focusing on, I want a really good UI designer, kick it up a notch and say, I want a really good UI designer, but they also have to fit. There's like a cultural or a chemistry kind of fit with this person as well. Because if you don't, what happens as soon as you get somebody in that doesn't follow that culture, that doesn't have that mindset, it actually detracts from the team, because it starts to water down the culture. It starts to water down a little bit. It'll even water down the vision, because they're maybe not going to go in the same direction. And then once one person does, then that, maybe the next person, maybe that person hires somebody that now is, even further from the culture, I like to think of it back to the like that, and there's a lot of places where this example works so well, is the idea of a cornerstone when you're building a building, when you're constructing a building, is the cornerstone is your true settings. It's your true, north and south and stuff like that. And if you think about like a square cornerstone, if you start laying out just trying to lay out the framework, the foundation of a building of like just a rectangle, well, if you keep laying the rocks, the other, square rocks to build this thing out, or bricks to build this thing out, if you're measuring from the cornerstone, then you're more likely to stay in line. But if you measure from, the next rock over and then the next rock over and the next rock over, you could be really out of sync very quickly.
Right.
And so you sort of have this same thing with that culture and with the product, is being able to instill that and keep talking about that on a regular basis. You got to sort of keep that, I think, at the top of people's mind of, what are we really doing here? What is our goal? So that why of the company is impressed on others, that they understand it, and that they build it and they live it. Because if not, like I said, you'll see stuff drift, and sometimes it's okay to drift, but sometimes it drifts in very bad areas. But particularly early on, you really want to have, as long as you can, you want to be able to have people that really fit that culture and have the same why or close enough to it that that then just permeates everything you do.
I got you. That's good.
All right. Other questions or comments?
Yeah, question. Does Disney, do they have to do, if you have already culture, do you have to go do a lot of research before you implement like any new change? In other words, do they have like a research department in their business whereby, okay, for instance, like we want to change this ride because we expect, ride maybe CDC, the one we saw in Six Flags, makes more money than maybe the ride here. Do they do stuff like that, or everything they think of is just original from the original owner?
Oh, I'm sure they do a lot of look, and if you look at how they've evolved rides over the years, if you look at amusement parks in general, there's sort of, I guess, like families of rides that you'll see over the years and some like roller coasters have existed forever. But if you even look at roller coaster technology, it's changed so that we've been able to do things like, go from just a little up and down roller coaster to things that do loops and things that have people hanging instead of sitting in chairs. And, now there's been families that like, log flumes, where you've got a, log ride where you're basically in water and you have a big fall and everybody gets wet. You have families of rides that have been more recent. There's the elevator, drop kind of rides where it's basically you just get, just takes you up to a certain height and drops you to a certain point, maybe bounces you a little bit, stuff like that. There's these family of rides. And another interesting thing about Disney is that if you look at their version of all of these rides, it is, I refer to it as it is the easiest entry into that kind of a ride, because the way they do it is they find the best ways that, from an engineering point of view, I think they find the best ways to share that experience and all of the positives without the negatives. Like, for example, if you go on their rides, all of their roller coasters and drop rides and stuff like that, almost, I think all of them, there may be one or two, but basically they'll, like the drops, it'll drop you at just fast enough that your stomach's almost to that, like butterflies in your stomach thing that you get when you think about like a free fall or something like that, but not, they get you like right to the edge, but not there. So it's like almost to the point where it would be, where it would trigger something in your body, physically or whatever, which is why some people like some of those kinds of rides. but then it stops right there, so that the discomfort, if you call it that, doesn't exist. And we talked about it like in a couple of rides. I was talking with my kids about a few of these. It's like if we had done, there's like a certain, like, you're spinning or you're falling or something like that. It's like if that had lasted another second or another 5 seconds, then it probably would have been too much, but it was just right. And you think about like just a 4-star restaurant. You have these meals where it's, they put it in front of you and it's just the right spices, just cooked the right temperature, stuff like that. It's the same kind of concept. And that's really what, you can bring that into software as well. It's like just the right approach, so that which the balance we always are trying to get is so that we can get the data we need out of the customer, but it doesn't bug them. It's not so much they feel like they're being bugged for too much data or spending too much time on input. When we do reports, we give them just the right amount of data in the report so they get what they need, but they don't have a lot of superfluous data floating around, stuff like that. And that's really, that's what they do. Is I would assume they have huge amounts of research departments where they go out and they look at what's out there and they say, okay, we can do it, and probably start. And this is something I've seen over the years too, is they start with, more or less the best solutions to that problem. But then they take that, and over time, like, you can do with a lot of stuff, you measure how it works and where it's at. And you get, into that 80% of the solution, but then you really refine things so you can get to the 100% point of the solution. So it's not just research initial, but once you roll it out, continue looking at it, continue reviewing it. This is sort of that idea of invisible changes and such, where you're still making a little bit, you've got it out there and people are using it, but based on feedback and based on the results, you're still making a little bit of tweaks here and there. So it's like you never stop saying, well, we can do this a little better. And I think that's the approach that, that's part of the approach they take. And it's part of the approach that, you see in, highly successful organizations, really anywhere.
Okay. All right. Cool. Thanks.
Other questions or comments? All right, then. So what have we learned? What was the purpose of this? Well, really it gets down to, dream big, have a big vision, but as you're building it, it still goes back to, you want to build in, you want to be firmly grounded in reality. It's like, I've got these huge goals, but to get there, I can't go directly from A to Z. I've got a journey ahead of me. So you are intentionally making those shorter term steps, knowing that you have a longer term journey ahead of you. It's like a marathon runner. If they sprint the first 100 meters, then they're probably not going to make the marathon. If they keep sprinting all these little short things, they're going to wear themselves out and won't be able to go the full 26 miles. Versus setting a good pace, making sure that you achieve the goals as you get there. They make their mile markers and stuff like that. Then they'll be able to, achieve that larger goal. Do your best to leave your options available. This is almost like a newbie kind of mistake I think that people make, is that, developers will get in there and they just sort of like, brute force create a solution and end up, they eliminate some abilities to enhance it, or, they code themselves into a corner. So, be intentional, spend a little time thinking and designing through stuff before you dive into it, and do your best to avoid coding yourself into a corner. It seems it's simple, but it's hard. It's so simple to create it, but it's so hard to, actually implement it. Is having a good idea and a good team, because if you have those two, you're going to be successful. But being able to make, it's easier said than done. But in so doing, in saying that, it's still, you've got to be intentional really from the start. If you build it from the ground up, you're a little more likely, you're going to reduce the chances of bringing in some bad seeds or team members that dilute the goodness, the effectiveness of your team. You got to be patient. Even these big goals, nothing big gets done overnight. So you got to be patient And it goes back to making small steps, that steady progress, little here, little there over time. Suddenly you will have you can be able to look back and realize that you've had a very long journey, but you've been successful. You've achieved some of those big goals. So as always, thanks for your time. Thank you for listening, for your feedback. Always enjoy doing these and always enjoy getting some good questions at the end of them. If there's any questions, comments or anything like that, always catch us at info@developerpreneur.com. I still have the contact us form out on developerpreneur.com. At Developerpreneur on Twitter, continue to have stuff out there all the time, and you can connect anytime. And then Facebook, yes, even though it is going the way of the dodo at times, we're still out there. We've got a nice little Developerpreneur page on Facebook that we post a lot of this stuff out there. And we just continue moving on, taking those steps every day, trying to make every developer that we can just a little bit better, so that hopefully some day we'll be able to look back and say, man, we have all made had some incredible journeys. Thank you.